Welcome from the Office for Education Policy. I'm Denise Arola, Associate Director, and this is part 2 of a new video series addressing frequently asked questions. This one is specific to how do I plan for within-year growth? As mentioned in part 1 of the series, we're really looking at 2 different types: year-to-year, which is summative to summative, value-added growth that serves a particular purpose, and within year, which can be interim to summative, interim to summative. As long as you've got at least 2 data points, you're going to be able to talk about progress. And importantly, the purpose of within year is to understand how students are progressing in their learning toward end of the year grade level expectations. In part 1, I talked about the importance of design of an assessment and its intended purpose, and not just the assessment itself, but the entire system, how we have to recognize that. So Atlas is to understand how students are performing relative to grade level expectations, and that is a unifying theme across the systems. And what it does is it allows additional tools to support learning throughout the year aligned within the system, so that you're not guessing about whether or not the standards that students are being assessed on at the end of the year are the same ones that they're being assessed on at the beginning of the year or in other forms of assessments that you're using. So it's standards-based and within grade, and that becomes very important. So this is where we can talk a little bit about numbers, but I'm also going to make a couple of suggestions about how do we look at those numbers. So it is a within grade scale. That means 1,060 is proficient for every subject and grade level. Kids can score from 1,000 to 1,120. And importantly, the interims are mini summatives, meaning they're built on the same blueprint. The other thing I should have added in here is that this is computer adaptive. It's computer adaptive on the interims and on the summatives, and that impacts things. When we take into consideration the computer adaptive design of our Atlas interims and summatives, it makes a difference, because that means it's not about just increasing by an item. This is not about getting more items correct or increasing your percent correct directly. It's about which items you're getting correctly completed and what are the difficulties of those items, because it allows for each student to have different items presented based on how they're doing on prior items, which means that not every student's getting the same number of items or the same item difficulties as they go through. So it's not as direct as what we were used to, but it gives us a much more precise idea of where students are relative to grade level. So the trade-off is that we're understanding a student's ability relative to grade level standards at a more precise level. In part 1, I mentioned this slide. How do you plan for growth throughout the year in order to impact growth from year to year? This is where the connection to instruction is so critical. And I know some of you at the administrative level are struggling to replace the systems you've used in the past to support helping students grow. And in this case, we want to use the system the way it was designed. So we know that all students are going to be evaluated at the end of the year on the summative assessment against grade level expectations. We know that the interims are mini summatives, that they're also computer adaptive, and we know that there are tools that we can use to actually help us understand where students are and help them grow throughout the year. Let's take a look. What we're looking for in within-year growth is demonstrated change in student achievement. So within-year scale informs you where students are relative to grade level proficiency expected by the end of the year. So most students start out at a lower score at the beginning of the year. How they progress on the scale from beginning through to the end indicates if they're learning and are able to demonstrate proficiency on more grade level standards and at higher levels of cognitive rigor. So that's basically what we're thinking about through the year. If I could start an ideal year, I would start the year with a classroom full of students and I'd look at where they'd been. And I would want to conference with each of them, whether I'm using the end of the year summative from the year before, or preferably I would use the first interim for a pretest. And I'd want to conference with them about how they did, especially on that first interim. And I'd love to have a conversation about what helped them in the past to make progress and what didn't. Then I'd talk with them about goal setting, informed by where they were in their patterns of learning and where they are at the start of the new year. Not specifically a goal that's a certain scale score, because, if I set a number, how does that translate? But maybe about the concepts they're learning and what they might strengthen and what they might target for going deeper or higher in their learning. So in this particular screenshot, I've got a view of a longitudinal report that kind of gives me progress over time. This is third grade math, fall interim, winter, then the summative at the end of third grade, and then fall and winter interim for fourth grade. And the student, in this case, was a level 1. They were mostly below mastery, but that's not always the case. And depending on how they were in the different reporting categories, we may need to have a different response. So let's take a look at some examples. I do like having a longitudinal view of a student's progress on each of the reporting categories. And what I do is I look for whether the student is catching up over time. If they're starting low, whether when they catch up, do they maintain that in those different areas? So in this example, the student was a level 1 at the beginning of the fall of third grade. But by the winter, they were a level 2 and they were at or near mastery in one of the 3 areas. And then by the summative, they were at or near mastery in all the areas. So this student ended up with a level 3, but they progressed over time. So that tells me about how they demonstrated learning last year. But now they're with me, and when I got them, they started out as a level 1. But remember, it's a level 1 relative to the fourth grade standards. So that doesn't mean that they're coming to you with no background. It means they haven't learned the current grade level standards. And that's important, because I think sometimes we look at that below mastery and we just write it off. But when I look at the full profile, this really tells me that this is a student that's going to learn over the year. How do I engage the student well in being their own advocate for learning and for demonstrating their learning? Because take a look, by the winter interim, they now have at least one area where they're at or near mastery. I also look for patterns where maybe in one particular area they're doing better across the years than in another area. And that's another way that you can look at, how do I engage the student and support them in learning the standards for this year? This is a tale of 2 students. And in this, you can see that the student on the top, I have another longitudinal report here. This is a student who started out at the end of third grade at a level 3, but they started as a level 1, so they progressed below mastery across the board in the fall. Only one area. Notice it's geometry and measurement, which is something that some people don't even get to till the end of the year. And then they're at or near mastery across the board, and they're actually proficient. Now, on the student on the bottom, it's a little bit different. This student only had a winter, so it implies that this student came in during the middle of the year. And this student had a lower score at the winter interim and was below mastery. And again, because below mastery is related to the grade level, what we know is this student end of the year not quite where this student needed to be for grade 3. So what's interesting though is that this student, so let's take a look at both students the next year. Both students start the fall, and the student on the top who had the proficient score was below mastery, and at or near mastery. And then by the winter, they were at or near mastery in two of the three areas, but a different one from what they had done in the fall. So that tells me that this student is struggling for consistency on grade level. So where I target supporting them is going to be looking at where are the areas that they have the biggest struggle being consistent. Now the student on the bottom is demonstrating in the fall, they're coming in at or near mastery. So it makes you wonder, did the student get tutoring over the summer? Did they have a bad day at the end of the summative last year? I mean, this is why it's so important to look at the information in front of you, but also to put it into the context of the student over time. And what I also like to do is look at, okay, so this student started the year at or near mastery in all three areas, and their score was 1,056 plus or minus 4. That means they could have scored 1,058 or as low as 1,052. But then by the winter interim, not only are they still at or near mastery in two of the three categories, but in geometry and measurement, the student is above mastery. And so I'm wondering, like with each of these students, geometry and measurement seems like something that they have a tendency to do well with some exposure. And it makes me wonder, would this be an area to use to build out their skills, to keep them interested and focused, but to integrate some of the computation and algebraic reasoning and the number and place value so that they stay engaged and interested. Now, I know some of you are looking at this and going, there's no way that I can look at every single student's longitudinal report. But you can produce a student roster that shows you a larger group of students, and you can review that larger group of students for patterns. You could also produce that for interim 1 and interim 2 and for summative and pull those together so that you're looking at a full year of that information. Now, hopefully we'll get to the point where all of that shows together more easily for y'all so that you can just download it. But I want to highlight something here. I've highlighted in kind of this peach color students whose reporting category scores indicate that they didn't answer any items correctly. They have the lowest scale score of 1,000. They have the highest standard error of plus or minus 23. In these cases, I'm also looking and noticing that not all of these students have this peach color all the way across. So there seem to be, this is the winter, and these may be areas that they demonstrated well earlier in the year and just weren't motivated to do at the middle of the year. So motivation can play a role. In the rows here, you can see that reading fundamentals, and reading and vocabulary and reading informational texts have quite a few students with this peach color. And so I would reference the blueprints and the ALDs to figure out what is being asked of students in these categories. Now, I'm not about teaching to the test. I feel like really good instruction should take care of the test. But one thing I do know is that the standards that are bolded, every student's going to get questions about that. So if I'm not getting any correct, maybe that's where I start. I can't end there because they're going to get questions on the other standards. But if I have an area where they're not even getting a single item correct, I need to kind of explore that. It could be that they're a high-performing student who was bored with the passage. I mean, honestly, that really happens. Some of you may have been that student in your youth. So I just want to point out that there are different ways that you can look at patterns of within your growth. Now, in some cases, students who are moving, I'm going to go backwards. So I went backwards and pulled up the student who went from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 in 3rd grade and went from level 1 to level 2 so far in 4th grade. And I want you to notice those scale scores. In each of the cases, the student is scoring, for example, 1,038 plus 5, so the 13, so 1,043. And this student is scoring at 1,046 plus or minus 5. So even though the students, their score bands, their confidence bands are overlapping slightly. And I know we can set a goal beyond the confidence band, but even a student who is making really good within grade level growth may not always go across that. Those confidence bands may overlap and the student is still making progress. It really depends on how much learning the student is demonstrating and where they're starting. So how many points a student grows near the middle of the scale might be less than how many points a student might grow if they're starting out at the beginning or the very bottom. So this is why I don't like to give a single score point for a single student, because I feel like that could be misleading. And then if that's part of a student's goal setting and they don't make it and we're not really sure that that was an appropriate goal, that might be very demotivating. So I tend to focus more on the broader category and whether or not they're struggling to be at least at or near mastery on that category, or at least one or two categories by the winter interim. So that's how I use within year data to understand students' learning growth throughout the year. And if you're taking care of this, if students are growing and demonstrating more proficiency in more areas, then you're likely taking care of their expected growth from year to year. That completes part 2, within year growth. Stay tuned. We want to know your questions and suggestions. Also, if you have a response to this or something you'd like us to dig deeper into, it doesn't have to be a completely different question. It could be a clarification on how we responded to your first question. So thank you so much for interacting with us and being a part of getting to know how to help kids learn and grow within year and year to year.